All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture of HCI, or Barakasa, if you will. This lecture is going to be talking about Gestalt and semiotics. So there are a couple of things that I would like to take away from this. Is not all people are the same. Not all people have the same background as you. There are other cultures around the world that they interpret things which you actually interpret differently. So it has been known in culture and in history and based on what your background is, the colors even they have a certain meaning. It's for different cultures, so the same color could have a different meaning. So it's actually important that you understand that this actually exists, and you cannot imagine how many companies have actually lost a lot of money just because of they have offended a different nation because they use some sort of gestures or iconographies or concepts or colors that they are actually being interpreted in a different way because they had some sort of wars, or they have some sort of backgrounds that they have a different meaning than what you are interpreting. So it's actually important um, that you know about that. Okay. Now, I will actually get started with what is Gestalt. So Gestalt is a German word for shape or form. And it is in fact a therapy, a psychological or psychiatrical therapy, I think. So what the idea here is, the therapist actually sits down with you, and he or she is trying to help you out by uh, extracting yourself, like getting yourself out of your, like some sort of out of your body experience, let's say. So you look at yourself from an exterior point of view, and you start analyzing yourself, and then you start finding the problem, and then you solve it on your own through a series, of course, of questions and interactions of some sort. And the guy who coined it is actually, there is a video of him is actually practicing that live, and you can see it in the at the end of the slides. So that's that. Now Gestalt, actually we can utilize it when we are designing user interface. It's important that to understand that that we have switches inside our brain, let's say, and then we can utilize these switches in order to trigger interesting effects. So um, how can I put this? So for example, when you uh, I mean, there are not everything in the world, not every person is having the same triggers as you, but there are some global triggers that it's built into us as human beings that you cannot help it. You cannot help to minimize it, or like to bury it down, because it's built into you, right? Unless you have some sort of a disorder or have some sort of a brain illness, then probably these parts will not function. All right. So let's, for example, take one of the Gestalt properties, which is, for example, emergence. Now, the first thing when you look at it, your brain immediately starts to forming to make up a form. So when you look right now at this picture, you can start seeing that the dog is actually sniffing on the ground, for example, right? This Dalmatian dog sniffing on the ground. However, whenever you start leaving out the global picture and you start looking at the details, like these black dots, you actually, or when you keep an eye on, or like investigate the details of these black spots, you start losing the whole picture. So you cannot. So for example, if I analyze just only these white dots and black dots and these black shapes, you actually don't see the whole picture. But when you stop analyzing every small detail and then you look at the full picture, you start seeing the whole picture. And this is one of the interesting properties of Gestalt as well, the emergence property. Okay, we have this reification property where you can in fact your brain starts to form shapes on its own. So somehow your brain connects everything, and you think there's a triangle in the middle, right? Even though just a bunch of like spheres, let's say, or circles, let's say, well, when they are lost, for example, just a small piece, right? But however, because of their organization, how they are organized, you start seeing a different picture, right? It is the same thing when you start to seeing, for example, some sort of like continuities. Like, for example, when things start to continue, you think that there's like a some sort of a cutoff, and there's some sort of a continuity here. You think that this is a sphere, right? And it's actually being represented because you think of it as a sphere because you can see that how the cone is implanted in here, but you don't see that circle, that implantation there, right? So it gives you immediately this sense of depth, let's say, right? So this is one of the interesting properties of Gestalt, the reification. And we actually utilize this in user interface design in order for us to pull off some tricks on you that makes it either to communicate either a relaxing user interface or not. So it depends really on how you look at it. We're gonna actually get into I will show you actually one website article that shows you how you actually utilize these things. There's a Gestalt property. One of them is called multi-stability, where if you and I actually used to play this as a kid, you think of this cube as either facing downwards if you look at this side, right, or facing upwards if you think of it that the part here is just going upwards towards this part. So it's actually quite interesting, like kind of optical illusion. You need to really like switch your brain between those two, force it in order to see both of the pictures. It's the same thing when you see this cup or vase. You start seeing just only the first thing what you see is the vase, for example. But the next step you see is just, for example, the faces on the side, the two faces on the side, right? So we utilize this a lot in games. So we utilize this multi-stabilities in games. If you, for example, we look at the Team Fortress, for example, game, when they have been designing the characters, they were looking a lot at the silhouettes because it is important that whenever you see the character from really, really far away, you immediately recognize him, even though you don't see the character's details. You don't see the colors. You don't see how he's dressed. But for example, whenever you see this shape in your brain, you immediately recognize, aha, that's the character is coming towards me, right? So it is important to understand that we actually utilize Gestalt even in games, just to bring or communicate certain messages, even though you don't see it, but we just simply rely on that switch in your brain. The next one is the invariance, which you realize, for example, a certain object and its shape, how it looks like. And no matter how I actually rotate it, no matter how I distort it, you already know the actual original image or the actual original object. And you just simply know in your head that this is actually object that has been rotated, and that's it. If you take a coin and you just rotate it slightly bit, right, it's not becoming round anymore. It will just become oval, right? So when you take a coin, just rotate it a little bit on its to around its y-axis, for example, you'll actually start seeing it's oval. It is oval, but then in your brain you already know that the coin is round, and even though you see an oval coin, you know that it has been just rotated. It's just a different perspective. So this is one of the things regarding like one of the properties called the invariance. Now, there are multiple laws with Gestalt, right? And I mentioned some of it here. So the first one is the law of proximity. Your brain tends to group things based on their proximity. So whenever we look at this, we see this as one block. However, if we organize it in a different way, you see, for example, 3 columns, you don't see 3 rows. So if you look at this, your brain immediately sees just 3 groups rather than just simply like 6 rows. And this is actually quite interesting in user interface. Whenever you actually start grouping things which are relative to each other, closer to each other, right? We see this in menus, we see this in websites and their grid layouts and so on and so forth. Laws of similarity, where you actually start to group things automatically based on how similar they are. So the same block which you see here, it becomes just different, completely different whenever I color them. So I know that these guys are similar. So I immediately see in my brain that there are 3 black rows and 3 white rows, for example. Okay. Now, the second law is the law of symmetry. There are a lot of OCD people around the world, and even for non-OCDs, symmetry is sometimes perceived as something that is cool or something that is beautiful in our brains somehow, most of the time. So it gives us this feel of balance. All right, and we're gonna see it later on in a different website right now, or like on that article. I'll show to you how it looks like. The law of common fate. Usually people like to show this in graphs. Usually people will show this even in games. So for example, taking into account a graph, your brain tends to uh, 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 like jump into conclusion and do predictions immediately. Like you immediately foresee at least a little bit forward the uh, a certain action or certain event that's going to happen. So, for example, if we look at the graph, when you see those 2 lines are going, if we extend, for example, from May to, let's say, June, for instance, you will immediately you will predict that, for example, that these lines will still go, even though that there is a probability of them going down. But this still, your brain has this feeling of everything going up and never goes down. And this actually, I took it from an article where I think I've listed it in the further readings and resources, where actually people, the article suggests that you use sometimes these tricks in order to show, to make your graphs more positive or negative, depends on what you would like to communicate, based on this idea of common law of fate. For example, if you look at these circles, even though the circles are in place, but they are this idea of going to the left, they give the feeling that they are also pointing to the left or going to the left. For example, in games we use this idea of common fate, for example, in Lemmings. So Lemmings, the game, it's an old game. It's quite fun. So, for example, whenever you see a group of people are going, the new ones which are gonna go, you immediately know where they are gonna just follow. It is the same thing when you are driving your car and you see the trees are just passing by, and you already, while driving, you already know the next tree when it comes, based on your direction of travel, you will know immediately this will go by in a certain way. So this is the law of common fate. The next one is the law of continuity and law of closure. So we actually see that even though we know that, for example, a line, for example, passed through the G, or for example, some of the lines of the circle or the square has been just simply trimmed off, your brain immediately just simply connects it to make a circle out of it, or to make the G complete, right? The law of continuity, we already know, for example, that this line is continuing going through the S. It doesn't cut off, it doesn't lose anything, it just simply carries on, which, for example, gives the S some sort of a depth right now. If you haven't noticed this, this is actually quite visible in, I think, let me just probably I will just probably show it to you a little bit later. For example, in the with the scroll bars, like for example, when you have when you're trying to adjust the sound, for example, when you try to adjust it, you see that you see, for example, you have a bar and then you have a knob in there, or like a small button in there. Whenever that, for example, bar passes under the button, you know that the bar is continuous. However, the button is staying in the middle, and you can in fact click and drag that button because you know it's actually going above or along that line. We realize that we can do that, for example, in equalizers. So if you look at equalizers on software equalizers, you can see that effect of continuity. You have, for example, the bar is just, like you have this finite bar, and then you have this small button where you can click and drag things, right? So this is regard Gestalt. Let me try to pull out that website. So this website, in fact, talking about how to utilize Gestalt in general, talking about these multi-stability, reification, and emergence, and of course the invariance, and how we actually utilize certain laws in order for us to start grouping things together, right? So proximities and how things affecting the user interface design, you start seeing, for example, how user interface starts to take shape. For example, you put things in proximity to each other, and then your brain immediately starts to group them. And if you put them in the same shape in a different, for example, some sort of a container, you start to group them as well in a different way, right? So, for example, you have as well not only with the similarity, but for example, you have with how do you call this, the symmetry. So for example, when the symmetry comes in, you see that the website is actually symmetrical, even though they look a little bit different. So these are just a bunch of different objects, and as you can see here, we are the design here is utilizing just the shape, right? It doesn't care about the details. It's just so we are just talking about right now the silhouettes of things. And if you look at the silhouettes of things, you realize that in fact the website, for example, in this case and in this case, is in fact symmetrical, even though you don't see it directly because you are busy with the details. However, subconsciously your brain is actually perceiving this as a cool or a beautiful website design. All right. So that being said, right now I would like to move on to semiotics. Okay. Now semiotics in fact affects us in what we use in order to signify certain things. Semiotics is the study of signs and their meanings, let's say. So what we usually do here is you utilize semiotics with iconography, for example, or symbolizing certain things. All right. There are many and there are many things could go wrong in here. So most of the time, if you are doing some sort of applications, or you are doing some sort of representations of certain things, please be careful what background you are communicating with. All right, because there are some certain icons could be offensive, and some certain which are totally fine for you. It's like totally acceptable in your culture. But however, if you use it in a different culture, it could be extremely offensive. So it is very important that whenever you actually start putting the actual iconography for your application, or some sort of signs for your applications, be careful how you put them. Understand first whom you are targeting and who's going to use it. All right, who's going to use your application, I mean. So there are many ways of representing semiotics. So there's a way, for example, that you use text. You could use images, you could use sounds, you could use smells, you could use flavors. It's all up to you. I mean, if smells for you is kind of funny, there are actually a certain shop, a very famous brand. I think it was Women's Secret. I need to confirm that probably. Where you where actually they wanted to make it their own. The smell of the shop, the smell of the shop has to be branded, because there's a certain perfume is being emitted, or being it's actually being emitted, and then within the space, and it's only known to that place, so that they would like to brand it on their own, to brand that smell, so nobody else can use that smell other than them. So even if you are walking on the street, and this shop was open the shop was open on the street, and even from far away, if you smell the smell, you will immediately recognize it. It immediately ties into your brain that this is actually the smell that's only relative to that shop, right? The same thing whenever you smell a certain kind of food on the streets, and you immediately know, or almost for certain you know, for example, a certain type of food is being cooked. It is actually similar in that fashion, right? So an example of using semiotics is, for example, if you put the open sign. So the word open in dictionary doesn't mean that for example, a shop is open. However, if I put the open on the door, I'm signifying that the shop has been opened. So the signifier is the open word. The signified is what has been signified. Is just simply saying that the shop is open for business. All right. Now, there are three types of signs over here. We have the symbolic, we have the iconic, and we have the indexical. So the symbolic is something that you cannot resemble the signifier at all. You cannot recognize it. It's just beyond recognition. You have to learn it. So like road signs. alphabetical letters and punctuations and other things. So for example, if you show this to a small kid, he will see a letter T, um, if he just start to learn. Uh, but if the kid was just trying to, if the kid learned, for example, that's the signs, for instance, they will realize that this is a road with a dead end. All right. You have, for example, the fire hazards. For example, this is indexical. That means I am directly saying that this is a fire, and I'm drawing to you a fire just to signify this is a fire hazard. So I'm drawing to you the fire. If I would like to show it in an iconic way, I'll just simply show a smoke. And smoke here uh, is representing that you have that there is a source of fire. So if there is a fire, if there is a smoke, then surely, most probably, there is a fire. Okay, and this is what you can see in front of the car. So a triangle doesn't mean anything to you unless somebody explicitly told you that the orange triangle on a large truck means this is actually carrying some fire hazardous substances or objects. Now, of course, people can try to start to. I actually took this, I think, from Stanford. This part of the iconography things. So people, when they try to represent the calculator icon, you can actually present it in a different way. You can go abstract and abstract and abstract until the point where it's actually completely unrecognizable, right? So there is a certain limit how far you can go symbolic before, I mean, how you could abstract it before it goes to symbolism, and you really need to teach people what does this sign mean. All right. Now, it is important to understand that you need to use your signs and you need to be consistent with it, and you need to use it in the right place. So, for example, if you are, for example, saying that there is a message box with an OK and cancel, it belongs to the action which you are doing. It doesn't belong to the window, as you can see right here. Okay. Now, if we are going to talk about the laws of proximity of Gestalt, for example, right? You can see, for example, if we compare the Microsoft Word, the sketch interface, and the Open Office Writer sketch interface, you can see that there has been actually been grouped, right? And when just this designer just drew the line, he immediately grouped a certain actions together. Even for your brain, when you look at it, you immediately know that these are sections, and immediately they communicate certain things, right? So Microsoft Word, they have grouped their actions in their tools, for example, into 4 categories. I'm talking about the old Microsoft Word, not the new ones right now. And the Open Office Writer, they grouped it into 7 categories. So Microsoft ones is, for example, let's say that they have the first category, which talking about like is relating to the all actions which you have to do with the document. The second one is talking about online collaboration, emailing, and so on and so forth. And the last one is customization and extension, customizations and things which you can do to your actual software, which is actually a little bit different from the Open Office. Now, the takeaways from here is, what do you in fact communicate? So, for example, Microsoft has this emphasis on, in terms of functionalities. They push more functionalities towards this more communication, more collaboration. In the contrast, for example, with Open Office, and of course there are many things you could communicate, or they communicated through their interface, and you could do the same thing by just utilizing this idea of semiotics and Gestalt, both of them, mixing them together. Right. So the last thing here, which I would like to mention, is the further readings. It's very important that you actually follow them. This is not mandatory, but this is actually quite interesting because Fritz Perls, the one who actually coined the term Gestalt, and he's the one who made this kind of therapy, I think. He's actually, this is his YouTube from 1970s, showing a half an hour session with a bunch of people talking about Gestalt and what does it mean and why it's there, and how he actually carried it on in action. I've been watching a lot of lectures about Gestalt from different universities and Gestalt laws. I found out that the Wikipedia articles, they have actually summarized what I have actually said right now, even, and what they have said exactly the same. So most of the words which you can see on the slides are being actually directly quoted from Wikipedia. And there are other The website which I've shown you, which is talking about the principles of UI design, is here. The actual the further reading about the semiotics, the whole lecture or the whole text, you can find it in that link below. All right, so thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next one.